It's time for Health Futures with Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth. This is Arizona's only show dedicated to providing you with expert advice on how to live a longer, healthier, and happier life. To learn more, call 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Bob Roth.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you. I'm your host, Bob Roth, and it must be Friday. And indeed it is. We're coming at you live from the Air Park Studios here in Scottsdale, Money Radio, 1510 AM, 105.3 FM, and the World Wide Web, moneyradio1510.com. If this is the first time you're tuning into our show is about how our older adult population can live a healthier, happier life. How do we do that? We do that by bringing extraordinary guests to the show. And today's no different. I'm really pleased to have in the studio with me is Dr. Michael Gordon. He specializes in medical oncology and hematology. He is with Honor Health. He's also with the Arizona Center for Cancer Care. And if you've been listening to our show, we had Dr. Janicic on a couple weeks ago, and we also had Dr. Skolnick on. And I'm really pleased to have Dr. Gordon here in the studio because he was my stepmom and my father's oncologist. So without further ado, Dr. Michael Gordon, welcome to Health Futures.
Well, thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to participate in your show. I've heard wonderful things about it, listened to some of my colleagues on it. It's been very informative and really of great interest.
Well, I tell you what, I have an incredible respect for you because I got a chance to experience you from a professional standpoint, both with my dad and with my stepmom, Maddie. And I will tell you, both of them had extraordinary experiences, as did I. I guess they say in layperson's term, your bedside manner was extraordinary, and I would imagine most of your patients say the same. So thank you for taking very good care of them.
Well, it was my pleasure, and I appreciate that very positive feedback. I think, nowadays in medicine, when you're taking care of patients, do the best you can to ensure that you're providing patients with a strong encounter where they feel that their physicians are engaged rather than a fly-by-night type of experience. So I greatly appreciate that.
Well, you did incredible work for them, and I want our listeners to really know a little bit about you. So rather than me reading your bio, I know you're from New York, and you have a beautiful wife, Sandy, who I've gotten a chance to get to know telephonically, but I wanted to get a chance to have you share with our listeners a little bit about you and your background.
Sure. Thank you so much. So yes, I'm originally from New York, though Sandy is not. She's originally from Chicago, and will always be very upfront about making sure that no one misconstrues that she's from New York. I went to medical school at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and following graduation did my internal medicine residency at the University of Chicago, followed by my hematology oncology fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering back in New York. After that, spent 9 years on the faculty at Indiana University, working with a great group of colleagues, and roughly 22 years ago was recruited out here by my partner, Dr. Daniel Von Hoff, who was then the Cancer Center Director for the Arizona Cancer Center, and I was brought in to ostensibly set up an early phase clinical trials program to complement the outstanding care delivered in the community with what was then Scottsdale Healthcare. Over time, my relationships have evolved. You mentioned the Arizona Center for Cancer Care. When we privatized our clinical trials program, we became part of that group. And then about 4 years ago, through an evolution of the relationship between Honor Health and the Arizona Center for Cancer Care, I eventually moved full-time over to Honor Health, and actually in May became the Chief Medical Officer for the Honor Health Research and Innovation Institute, which includes our cores of cancer, so our oncology clinical trials program, cardiovascular science, and neurosciences, as well as clinical trials programs in bariatrics, GI, and with the development of the pandemic, we have a COVID clinical trials program that we initiated as a pivot point so that we could address the unmet need in caring for our patients in the hospital.
You're a very busy man, a very busy doctor. That is for sure.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think that I'm a sun up to sundown and beyond kind of practitioner. And as you noted, a big portion of what we do focuses on the delivery of care. Our program at the Research Institute focuses on those patients in general who have exhausted their standard of care options and are looking for hope. And hope comes in many different ways. It comes in the quality of care that's delivered, but more importantly for us, it comes in the form of early phase clinical trials, new drugs, and trying to extend people's lives with good quality of life.
Before we jump into some of the work that you're doing, why did you choose oncology and hematology?
Yeah, I had great role models when I was going through my early education. And so when I graduated from high school, I entered into a 6-year biomedical program through the City College of New York and ultimately State University of New York in Buffalo. But my family had direct contacts with a number of oncologists, and I was able to begin doing some laboratory work, and those role models and mentors really helped to shape my focus on cancer care. And certainly back then, and now we're talking about the early to mid 1980s, there were huge unmet needs, and I saw it as a unique opportunity to not only practice medicine at the highest level, but moreover to hopefully favorably impact patients and their families.
Well, I will tell you, as you described some of the work that you're doing, I knew you were involved in research, but didn't know to the extent you are. You're doing some amazing work.
Yeah, we are an organization that has focused on growing the portfolio of our clinical trials program. And I would say that there is a triad of programs that the Research Institute for Cancer is focused upon. The first is our pancreatic cancer program, where we've been among the most innovative programs in the country in terms of transforming the way care is delivered for patients with pancreatic cancer. Our cutaneous oncology program, so that includes programs like melanoma and skin cancers, but also very rare cancers like melanoma that starts in the eye, where my colleague and partner, Dr. Justin Moser, is really, again, innovating the way we care for patients with that disease. And then the third core of our program is, our phase 1 drug development program. Phase 1 studies are new drugs entering into clinical trials for the first time. Those are often studies looking at the safety of drugs. And whereas 20 to 30 years ago, the success rate of those drugs was minimal to marginal, over the last 10 years, we've seen a transformation with a number of new immunotherapy drugs, which not only produce responses, but actually produce cures in patients with refractory cancer. And so that's been a really transformative time for us in the oncology enterprise.
You mentioned Dr. Daniel Von Hoff. For those that don't know, he's a rock star. He really, well known in the medical community, and I can see why you were attracted to come here to Arizona to work with him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Dan is somebody who I greatly respect, and in truth he's been a great model to emulate, not only for myself, but for our other faculty members and for our staff. He has great humility, but he treats his patients with tremendous focus and affection, and delivers the most outstanding care, and is focused on really bringing the best options to patients in the most innovative ways.
And it's amazing, sun up to sundown. Not only are you seeing patients, but you're deeply involved in these clinical trials, and and research that is being done. We are just at the tip of the iceberg. We are down one segment. We've got 3 more to go. I've got Dr. Michael Gordon here in the studio with me. Stick around. We will be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. And if you're just tuning in, we're in our second segment here. I've got Dr. Michael Gordon here in the studio. He specializes in medical oncology and hematology, works over at Honor Health. And if you missed that first segment, go out to our website at cypresshomecare.com. Click on the media button. Third button down is radio show. You'll catch this show and many, many more. So, Michael, we got a chance to really talk a little bit about some of the work that you're doing. And I want to take this segment and really talk about how cancer care has really evolved, because you're treating cancer today, and you talked about studying and going to school and doing some of the work you did in the 80s. Now we're in 2022. It has certainly evolved, and would love for you to share with our listeners what are some of the evolutions that you've seen that really make the prospect of treatment more successful. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for.
Successful is definitely the right word. I think that over an interval of time, we began to understand the basis of what causes or drives the growth of cancer. And in many cases, we found that cancer can be related to a particular abnormality or a mutation that may occur within the cancer cell, and that may be, as a what we call driver mutation, may be responsible for the growth and progression of the cancer. Recognizing that, we had the advantage of then being able to then work with colleagues and develop drugs against those driver mutations and targets, ostensibly to turn them off. So now what's happened is what had been a common disease, lung cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, and were treated uniformly with one form of treatment or another, we now have subsets within those diseases. For lung cancer, it may be a mutation in the epidermal growth factor receptor, or the ALK1, or ROS1, and each of those mutations has a specific drug that targets that driver mutation and can generate fairly dramatic responses. Those treatments are not curative in nature, but they definitely improve quality of life and extend lives for patients with those definable diseases. And that means that for many cancers, once the diagnosis of cancer is made, the next major step is sending tissue, the tumor biopsy, out to a commercial laboratory where technology is applied to look at the 20,000 plus genes in that cancer and scope it out for these mutations, seeking to identify driver mutations that may be treated first, second, third in the course of treatment. And as these therapies have evolved, they have, again, transformed care. For the people that don't have driver mutations, the other major advance, which is expanding its realm within oncology, as I mentioned in the last segment, is the use of immunotherapy drugs that are designed to activate the body's own immune system to fight the cancer. And in those cases, not only do we see that the immunotherapy drugs can be given alone, but they can be given in combination with chemotherapy, and they will improve not only response rates and survival, but can even lead to eradication of metastatic disease, thereby providing us with what has always been the elusive cure for people with metastatic cancer. And so this has really revolutionized the way we treat cancer. It's complicated it because life was somewhat more straightforward when you could sit down and had one type of therapy for one type of cancer. It's a bit harder to explain to patients the nuances of traveling down this road and the information we need to get. And that's an undertaking and a process that I think we now train our students and our trainees to be able to articulate in a particularly effective way.
So it really is where science and technology really meet, because I mean, obviously, you're talking about 20,000 genes, and if I remember, I think Dr. Janicek may have said there was about 600. Is that correct about the the mutations, the driver mutations? There's 600 that you got to.
There's probably a number akin to that across the broad range of all different types of cancers.
But I mean, when you think about back in the 80s, you could never do any of this type of
No, this
work.
technology did not exist back then, and I think that there were a lot of people that formulated the hypotheses back then, and that's what ultimately led to the identification. But the ability to actually do, when you think about the human genome and what was done at commercial laboratories and at the NIH, the technology that was necessary to do evaluation of the entire genome took decades to advance.
And now it can be done.
Commonplace among these commercial laboratories with a turnaround time which is getting shorter and shorter.
Fascinating. It really is. And for you as a practitioner and as an oncologist, when you see these positive results and you see these therapies really working, it just must really, bring a smile to you. And I mean, seeing the success of treatment, and while it may not be curative, it puts people in a better place than they would have been otherwise.
Yeah, and I think in particular, from our point of view at the Honor Health Research and Innovation Institute, when we get pharmaceutical companies coming to us with a new drug for a new target, and we know that there are going to be patients who are referred to us from the community at large because they have progressed on all standard effective treatments. If we can identify those new driver mutations and employ these new drugs, it's tremendously satisfying to see patients who may have been symptomatic from the progression of their cancer who now get better. Their pain improves, their appetite improves, their quality of life improves. And you well know how important this is in terms of taking care of patients at home and working hard to get people back on their feet.
I don't think very many people realize that the research and innovation work that is being done at Honor Health, and you're leading a lot of that. And if you could, in just a couple minutes here, describe some of the stuff that is being done right here in our backyard. And obviously Dr. Daniel von Hoff is one of the catalysts that helped begin that, but you're spearheading a lot of the work, and it's not just in the research on cancer. I'd love for you, and you may get it started now, but if you don't finish it here in the second segment, maybe in the third segment, talk about COVID. I mean, you were doing amazing work with COVID as well.
Yeah, it's so the Honor Health Research Institute, which has now evolved to the Honor Health Research and Innovation Institute, started primarily focusing on oncology clinical trials, and we somewhat unfortunately look at ourselves as a best-kept secret, right? And with innovations across the board, we have kind of conceptualized the fact that 2022 is our coming out year. We want people to know about us. We want our colleagues and our partners to be aware. So, we run in oncology 50 to 60 phase 1 trials of new drugs across the portfolio of different cancers. And we work closely with our colleagues in the community so that they know when we're opening up new clinical trials. And we complement what they do. We work very hard to be complementary, collaborative, and non-competitive in that regard. But we also innovate. And so our work in pancreatic cancer has generated 2 of the last 3 frontline regimens for metastatic pancreatic cancer. And we're very excited about the implications of highly responsive treatments. 20 years ago, the response rate for metastatic pancreatic cancer was 7%.
Wow.
And our most recent regimen has a 70% objective response rate.
Wow.
And that type of advancement is unheard of. And now as you move that into earlier patients who have resectable disease where the goal is to treat microscopic cancer cells that might cause relapse later, we hope to be able to improve the cure rate of those patients. But as we've grown, our programs at Honor Health have also grown. And so our cardiovascular sciences program, led by Dr. David Reisig, has been first at the mark for doing a lot of innovative therapies, drug-eluting stents for patients with coronary artery disease, wireless pacemakers. The first one in the nation was placed at Honor Health earlier this year. And we continue to work hard with regard to a program in arrhythmia disorders, as well as our cardiothoracic surgical program. And then, of course, our neurosciences program, led by Dr. Todd Levine, is a focal point down on the Osborne campus, where we recently opened the new Bob Bove Institute down at the Osborne campus. And our work there focuses on numerous degenerative neurologic disorders, as well as a program on neurotrauma, since Osborne is our big trauma hospital, or one of our big trauma hospitals, and neuro-oncology, so brain cancers and brain tumors.
And I love that you have a partnership with Barrow.
We do.
And obviously Barrow has got such a great reputation and now is a partner of Honor Health, especially in that neurology area.
That's correct.
Which is really amazing. I mean, look, the best kept secret's out. So Michael, thank you for sharing. I mean, it is amazing the work that is being done in our backyard, and it's because of people like yourself that are leading that. You've been listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. We're at halftime here. I got Dr. Michael Gordon here in the studio. Stick around. We got one more half up. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth, and we are in our second half here in the studio. I've got Dr. Michael Gordon. He specializes in medical oncology and hematology. He is over at Honor Health. And if you missed our first half, go out to our website at cypresshomecare.com. Click on the media button, third button down is radio show. You'll catch this one and many, many more. So when we were talking about cancer, and we spent a lot of time talking about cancer, is, you know, the thing I really learned a lot about you is how much you're doing on the research side. And it's fascinating that, you know, we're getting the word out that Honor Health is on the cutting edge and doing all kinds of clinical trials right now. You mentioned you're doing somewhere between 50 and 60 phase 1 clinical trials. And, you know, I always wondered, when you're doing clinical trials, especially on cancer, because I know clinical trials are done in so many different areas, do people get placebos?
So not in our phase 1 studies.
Okay.
You know, placebo-controlled trials usually are at later phases, in late phase 2 or in phase 3, where we're trying to gauge the success of an established investigational drug. In phase 1, patients are getting a drug at a stepwise fashion of different doses. So it's like stepping onto a different rung of the ladder, and generally what we do is put 3 patients on the first rung of the ladder, and as long as nobody falls off the ladder, the next group go on the second rung and successively higher. And if somebody falls off, we don't know whether the ladder's too high or...
I love the visualization.
It works well with patients.
Yeah.
But we don't know if the ladder's too high or if they're just clumsy, and we'll put 3 more on.
Right.
And the goal of phase 1 is to establish the appropriate dose, what we call the maximum tolerated dose or the optimal biologic dose. And nowadays what tends to happen is once we establish that dose, we will expand the clinical trial into large numbers of different groups of patients with different diagnoses. And that will give us a big sniff test as to whether or not we're going to see effectiveness of the drug in generating response, delaying progression, extending life. And that will help us counsel the pharmaceutical company developing the drug in terms of the most efficient way of getting that drug developed, and ideally, if it's going to be successful, getting it to market.
All that science stuff is so fascinating to me. It really is. I could talk to you forever about it, but I want to really, I want to get down to just, the real basics. Cancer.
Yep.
Genetic, environment, genetic testing. Dr. Janasik and I talked about that. I would love for you to just at least weigh in on that. I mean, we talked about at the break about, food and its important source of, fueling our bodies.
Yeah, so overall, what the science has told us is that about 15 to 20% of cancer patients will have an underlying genetic mutation that may have placed them at increased risk for developing cancer. And that becomes important because in the world of GYN oncology that Dr. Janasek practices, such mutations such as the breast cancer genes BRCA1 and BRCA2 not only are risk factors for developing cancer, but we have targeted drugs, the PARP inhibitors, which can effectively treat patients with those mutations should they develop cancer. And those are used as primary treatments or in the maintenance setting after patients have had chemotherapy. And so identifying those are important, but that makes up, I would say, a minority of the cases. Environment has always been felt to be important. We've long known that smoking is a risk factor for many cancers, head and neck cancer, esophageal cancer. Exposure, we know that human papillomavirus, HPV-16, can be associated with head and neck cancers or with certain genital urinary cancers or gynecologic cancers. So that's one of the reasons why we have vaccines now against HPV recommended for children, prepubertal children, so that they can develop an immunity against the virus, and therefore if they are infected later when they become sexually active, they will not have persistent viral infections which could set them up for cancer in the future.
And what I learned from Dr. Janasik is it's for both females and males. Because a lot of people think it's just a female disorder.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah. So I want to talk about COVID. You guys did a lot of research on it. You're leading that research. You talk about the best known secret. I did not know you were working on some of the convalescent plasma techniques and stuff that were being done here.
Yeah. So, when COVID hit, I think it was a shock for everybody and a shock for most of the hospital systems. Within the Research Institute, one of the things that happened is that because we weren't able to effectively do elective surgical procedures, a number of our programs had to defer their clinical trials. And so rather than letting people go or furloughing staff, we made the decision to pivot. As it turns out, interestingly, a lot of the drugs, or many of the drugs that were developed for COVID, were either drugs that had a background in oncology, or the pharmaceutical companies were oncology participated companies. They had developed cancer treatments in the past, and therefore we had established relationships with them. So the Pfizers, the Red Hill Biopharma, the Veru companies, these were companies who by nature we were able to reach out to and say, what are you guys doing in COVID? And so we were able to get involved early with COVID targeted research because of our relationship with these companies from an oncology perspective, and that was an unexpected advantage. We were able to employ these trials across many of the hospitals within the Honor Health system, and we were able to have our staff focus and working with the staff on the floor. I think there were some added benefits in the first wave of COVID when we felt that there was a certain degree of futility, that there wasn't much we could do. I think we put about 1,000 patients on the National Convalescent Plasma Study, and it wasn't until later that we kind of appreciated that COVID convalescent plasma probably not as effective as we had hoped it would be. But I think for our nursing staff and for the doctors who were in the hospital taking care of COVID patients day and night, we provided them, as well as the patients, with a sense of hope, a sense of potential breakthrough. And they provided us with tremendous support and supported the consideration of trials for their patients.
No, it's fascinating that you were so intimately involved, and it all makes sense because you're working with these drug companies. And,
Right.
you know, how do you combat the misinformation that's out there? You know, you hear about hydrochloroquine, you hear about, you know, I forget what the other drugs that you've heard about,
So
but
ivermectin.
ivermectin. I mean, you know, look, I appreciate what you're saying is that, you know, a lot of these drug companies that were working on, you know, the type of stuff they were for cancer, it was an easy pivot for them to start working on this.
Right. And I think that, you know, there is a lot of interest in repurposing drugs, right? So hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, there was a lot of work done early on looking at established drugs for other indications and whether in the laboratory models they were able to show any kind of antiviral effect on COVID-19. And the misinformation that occurred, I think, was hope and expectation. I think that people were looking for some resources, and the difficulty was that the data just wasn't there. And so, you know, hydroxychloroquine was a realistic question. We opened an in-house trial with an analog of hydroxychloroquine because there was interesting preclinical data. But ultimately, when those trials are negative, much like we have to accept negative data in cancer, I would never go to a cancer patient and say, hey, I have this drug, it doesn't work, but let me give it to you anyway. And I think that's the unfortunate side of the COVID-19 data, that when it came out as negative, when the ivermectin data was negative, there is no value to using drugs that don't work.
Right.
And how do you combat misinformation? I think the best that you can do is provide accurate and thorough information. We worked very hard at Honor Health to make sure that our staff was up to date. As I mentioned to you, we have a COVID guidance committee that we call the Fight Club.
I love it.
And you know, we got together, whether in face-to-face or virtually, on a regular basis, and that was the responsibility of this group, was to assess the data and make determinations of what did or did not fall into the value proposition for the treatment of our patients. And I think many institutions around the country had similar approaches. And you know, what I think was really successful for us was the team approach. It was about educating our staff, educating our leaders so that they could then downstream educate others, and providing patients with a certain degree of confidence that the people taking care of them knew what they were doing and were aware and familiar with the information.
I love the team approach. You know, as we close this third segment, vaccinations, go get them, right?
Absolutely. Vaccinations and boosters are the most important way of preventing yourself from having severe or life-threatening COVID.
Good to hear. Well, we got 3 segments down. Got Dr. Michael Gordon here in the studio. Stick around. The 4th segment's going to be a winner, I promise you. So we will be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you. And if you're just tuning in, I got Dr. Michael Gordon here in the studio. He specializes in medical oncology and hematology, and he does amazing work and research over at Honor Health. And if you missed our first 3 segments, go out to our website at cypresshomecare.com. Click on the media button, 3rd button down as radio show. You'll catch the first 3 segments and many, many more. So, Michael, oncologist, you have your own journey.
I do.
And it is so ironic. I mean, here you specialize in cancer research and you're working with all these patients, and all of a sudden now you are a patient. I would love for you to take our listeners and me through that journey. And how did your diagnosis or symptoms start, and where are you now in this journey of yours?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. It's been an unusual circumstance. I tell people, and the New Yorkers remember this, it's like Hair Club for Men. I'm not only the president, but I'm also a client. And that's the way I feel about our clinical trials program and cancer care. My journey started with the fact that I had a root canal, and I had been taking a medication for pain that I started to develop head-to-toe itching, and I thought I had developed a rash. But I also noted that my urine was unusually dark, tea-colored, and my stools were unusually light, very tan-colored. And as an oncologist, I interpreted that possibly as meaning that I had an obstruction of my bile duct, and that the bile, which gives stool its color, and was not getting into my GI system. And when that bile or bilirubin backs up into the bloodstream, it can have you look jaundice, and it can cause your urine to get dark. But I looked at my eyes, and I didn't feel that I was jaundiced. And I made the crucial decision after that weekend to go immediately to see my internist. And we thought that I was probably developing some gallstones. And he ran some blood work in laboratories, and my liver enzymes, liver tests, were significantly abnormal. And that led to a rapid fire succession where the next day I had a CAT scan that showed initially what we thought were gallstones. But that night I got paid a visit by two of my colleagues who I absolutely adore, who came to my home and said, look, we've looked at your CAT scan and we think that you have a mass in your pancreas. And that was a shock, though I think as an oncologist, I was already thinking along those possible lines. The next morning I went in and had a stent placed to alleviate the obstruction and had biopsies done. And by Friday, those biopsies were read out as showing a pancreatic adenocarcinoma. And so I joined, the legion of my patients who had a diagnosis of cancer. And then I did what I tell people all the time to do, develop a plan. In my case, the first question that my family asked me is, should you go someplace else? Should you go to Houston? Should you go to New York? You were a fellow at Sloan Kettering. Should you go back there? And I just smiled and I said, ironically, I am at what I consider to be the top pancreas cancer institution in the country. And I have an incredible team. Dan Von Hoff kind of is my figurehead, but Dr. Erkut Borzanci and Gail Jameson, one of our nurse practitioner investigators, are the core element of the people who directly take care of me. And they together scoped out what they called Mission Michael, which was a plan of getting me through this. I had a resectable pancreatic cancer, which means there was no obstruction to having surgery. But what we know these days is that there is a very high risk of recurrence if you just go right to surgery. So the routine these days is to use preoperative chemotherapy and radiation. And I started on our our regimen, what we call the triplet, which is a combination of two standard drugs, gemcitabine and nab-paclitaxel with cisplatin. It's now listed in the national guidelines as a standard treatment for metastatic disease, but we had already studied it in the preoperative setting. We knew it was highly effective. I went through 3 months of that very intense regimen. In conjunction with that, I was guided to go on a ketogenic diet because we had data from a colleague of ours on the East Coast that showed that a ketogenic diet with chemotherapy was much more effective in models of pancreas cancer. And I actually went on hydroxychloroquine because, again, there was data 2 randomized placebo-controlled trials in the preoperative setting that showed superiority for that combination with chemo against just chemo alone. And so you might say that I endured the kitchen sink, but when you're placed in the position of wanting to do everything you can, that's what you do. And so we completed 3 months of chemo. My CAT scans looked about the same. I met with my surgeon who recommended that we proceed with 5 weeks of chemotherapy and radiation. Did all of that with my colleague, Dr. Steve Skolnick, who is my radiation oncologist. And then in mid-November, underwent a Whipple surgical procedure, about one of the biggest surgeries that you can do in terms of rearranging the tubes and the piping. And, I've been absolutely blessed with having tolerated my chemotherapy, my radiation, and my surgery amazingly well. And I don't know what the secret of that is, other than, maybe someone's looking out for me. And I've embraced the people who have showered me with good wishes and prayers and prayer groups. And I tell them all the time, I can definitely feel that. I know that people are thinking about me, because there's no other way that I can explain it. And I came through my surgery, and amazingly, I'm in the less than 10% of population who had no evidence of cancer on the pathology from my Whipple. So my treatment had been amazingly effective. And that was a great moment of emotion and celebration for all of us, for my team, for my family. And after we were done, I spent about 6 weeks recovering from the surgery. And then we had a discussion about the icing on the cake. How do we try and improve the likelihood of cure? And so I went through another 2 months of additional chemotherapy that finished up about 2 weeks ago. And now I'm coming out of the other end, a transformed person.
I would imagine. It's amazing. You look great.
Well, thank you.
And I know you've been working all along, which is phenomenal. And I'm sure it's been a great way to, really take your mind off of the cancer and really do the work that you have been intended to do and you are passionate about doing. And I can't thank you enough for joining us here on the show and actually sharing this journey that you're on right now. And I use the word ironic. I mean, you now are in that position where you can really appreciate what your patients go through, especially chemotherapy, radiation, and for those that may go through a Whipple procedure.
Yeah, it is amazing. I'm also one of that 16% of pancreas patients who do harbor an underlying genetic risk. So this was kind of predetermined that the risk of cancer was there.
But you didn't know that till after.
I didn't know that until after I was diagnosed.
Right.
And so, this is, it was a challenge. You're right. I worked full time throughout all my chemotherapy. It was my salvation. It kept me out of my wife's hair when she needed a little bit of a break from what we were enduring. My staff has been incredible. My patients have been incredible. The ketogenic diet is designed to have you lose weight, and I've lost 40 pounds.
You look great.
So, but it was pretty evident to people that something was going on, and I kept it from patients because I didn't want my patients to be troubled with my experience. But then when I went out for surgery, I wrote them a heartfelt letter explaining that I had joined their numbers and this is where we were at and this was our plan. And it will be very gratifying to eventually get back to the clinic and re-engage my patients who, I've been getting routinely cards from them just wishing me the best.
Well, we're a recipient of your letter. So it wasn't just for current patients, but it was previous patients too. And, our prayers were with you, Dr. Michael Gordon, all along the way. And it's so wonderful to see you here on the other side. And I can't thank you enough for donning our studio and sharing with our listeners, not only about your journey, but the incredible work that is being done. The secret's out about Honor Health, innovation, and tech, and all this stuff that is being done right here in our backyard. Thank you for joining me. Make it a great day. Have a great weekend, and we'll be back next Friday.
There's no place like home. You've been listening to Bob Roth's Health Futures. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call Cypress Home Care Solutions at 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Or visit cypresshomecare.com. Be sure to join Health Futures with Bob Roth every Friday at noon, right here on Money Radio 1510 and 105.3 FM.